SECfans.com. You knew we were going to talk about it. Alabama and Georgia. Last video for us for the college football season. We're going to do some stuff in the offseason too, but we're probably going to hibernate a little bit. It's been a long year as usual, and this one's going to be a fun one. We've got Alabama and Georgia in an all SEC national championship game. I've already seen the post on Twitter from the SEC haters saying they're not going to watch it. I think they even got a cute little hashtag. Lots of salt out there from the non-SEC fans, and probably, unfortunately, from the Auburn fans too, given how their season ended up and the two teams that are playing for it all right now. But we're not gonna rub salt in anybody's wounds right now. We want to talk about this game, and we're fresh off of two high-profile games in the semifinals that gives us sort of a baseline. And it's interesting because we have sort of a baseline to discuss because we already did a hypothetical on these two teams halfway through the season. So I'm interested to see if anything's changed from that hypothetical. I'm sure it has. And then we want to talk about some of these matchups in particular because we're so well versed on these teams. We've followed them all year. But before we get into it, I want to remind everybody in the comments, please give us your MVP. Tell us give us your score prediction, obviously, and give us your MVP and any other, insight you want to give. Make sure you back it up with data. Also, if you like or love this video, give us a like. If you don't, give us a thumbs down. Back up your points again. And if you really love it, how about a subscribe? All right. So there's coming off the heels of the big Oklahoma win for Georgia and the big win for Alabama, although it was kind of ugly. I want to talk about Georgia's defense in the Oklahoma game and Alabama's offense in the Clemson game. So if you look at just the score, just the box score, just the fact that Oklahoma put up 45 in regulation, 31 in the first half. There's going to be a lot of people say, and I've seen a lot of Oklahoma fans talk about how, even Gary Patterson, if you watch the coach's live observations, he was talking about how there's just really good offenses in the Big 12, and it, the hinting that the big SEC defenses are a little overrated. Did you get a takeaway from this game that, man, Georgia fans really need to be worried because they've been looking pretty good all year. They play a real offense against Oklahoma. Boom, they give up 45. Or is Baker Mayfield, this Oklahoma attack, especially seeing it for the first time, just that much of a shock, and it's not something that Georgia fans should necessarily dive too much and take too much into?
It's an interesting question. I think when you break it down and look at the way the game went, Georgia really stymied Oklahoma in the third quarter, held them, I won't say in check, but slowed them down in the fourth quarter enough to force the overtime. It definitely seemed like there was a shock factor at the beginning when Oklahoma was working off their scripted drives. Mayfield was just on point. When we talked about this game before and we did our predictions, my personal prediction was 42-39 Oklahoma, which I don't think was obviously not that far off from the 40-ish points that were scored in regulation in this game. And my whole thing was, I just thought Mayfield himself was that good, that he'd find a way to win in what I thought was going to be a very close, high-scoring game. And that didn't end up happening, but it's not like any of this is a shock. And you talked about Big 12 offenses being that good. I mean, Oklahoma regularly put up yardage and points like this. I mean, their season averages were 5.6 yards per carry, 12 yards per pass. They didn't hit either of those against Georgia. I mean, they were in the pass 8 yards per attempt, which is still pretty darn good, but that's well below 12 yards per attempt, their season average, and 8 yards per attempt is a good passing attack in most games. It's actually a little unusual that a team with their yard per play total would score as much as they did, being held to about 6.5 yards per play. It just, when they did score, they tend to do it, they tend to do it all at once. And you typically see that a lot in shot games. You see it with explosive offenses. If you want to score a lot of points with little yards, it usually means you had some drives that are really effective. So when you move the ball, every yard ended up, you scored. Every yard got turned into points. And when you didn't, when you weren't going to score, you just didn't move it at all. You went 3 and out or you went 100 yards. And that's kind of what we got from Oklahoma. And I do think shock factor was a factor. I will caution in this way, though. I think you have to be careful extrapolating what a conference does based off a given game and a given matchup. And really, the key here is Oklahoma was extremely effective on everyone they played all year. They were effective against Georgia, but 45 points in regulation really isn't anything that abnormal for them. And I think what's also notable with all this is if you want to talk about, well, the Big 12 offenses are so good, you can't discount the fact that Georgia tore through them like butter. And Georgia had not scored 54 points in a ball game all year. And here they scored 54 points in a ball game. And not only that, but they only ran 65 plays, 63 plays, excuse me, in this game. And 54 points in 63 plays is absolutely insane. So I think you also have to accept the fact that when Georgia at one point was running for 19.3 yards per carry. I mean, Oklahoma scored and scored well, and Georgia stalled a couple times that hurt them from keeping pace. But really, realistically, Georgia off and on was going to stop Oklahoma through this game. But I think you could have played this game for 12 quarters, and it had gotten to a point where Georgia would have scored a touchdown every time they got the ball for the rest of the game, however long to infinity you wanted to keep playing.
Yeah, and I think that was interesting for all of not just Gary Patterson, but everybody in that room talking about how well the Big 12 offenses are just that good, which I'm not taking anything away from Oklahoma. I think their offense is phenomenal, and I think they kill it in the SEC on average. But nobody's talking about the fact that at that point Georgia had 19 something yards per carry. I mean, Georgia has a good offense and they have a dominating run game, and this is why we both thought they would be able to score a lot of points, and it's why I picked them to win. But that it was kind of like they didn't consider the fact that Georgia was also being able to rack up all these points against this Oklahoma defense, and they couldn't do this inside the SEC. Now, yes, Georgia had some games where they scored 40 plus. I think they did, Kentucky, Missouri, that kind of thing, but I don't know that Georgia is the type of offense that can roll out a 45, 48 spot on anybody they want to yet. And that's not a slight on Georgia. I don't think most offenses in college football history could do that. So that says a little bit, somewhat about the Oklahoma defense, but it also says a little bit, I think, about sometimes you just get this kind of game. And maybe speak to that a little bit, because we saw it 2 years in a row with Clemson and Alabama both having really good offenses, but not necessarily Oklahoma type offenses, but also both having, at least statistically, elite defenses. And I'm talking 2015, 2016, and both of those games still turned out to be a shootout. Talk about how sometimes the offenses just end up clicking in games on a big stage, and it's not necessarily I guess I'm trying to go back to the fact that I'm not necessarily down on Georgia's defense after that performance, and that's another reason why.
It's an interesting thing and something I've never really been able to completely wrap my head around, but it seems to happen a lot. My biggest thing would probably be motivation as a factor, that you have offenses that really want to score and the offensive line is extremely motivated. You see a lot in college football. If teams are really motivated, the offensive line can take over a game. And that goes a long way offensively for everything you want to do. But I think a big point too is in these games, teams have a lot of time offensively to figure out what they're doing wrong and to sort of hone and narrow down to what they do right and expand upon the things they do right and really whittle the playbook down to the things that function well. I think they also take more risks in these games. So you come out in a bowl and you're going to run the plays that are the most effective. You're going to add a bunch of new plays, and a lot of them gadget plays, or really interesting wrinkles that you haven't seen before that build on the things that were successful. And you have no incentive to hold anything back whatsoever because it's single elimination. You've got to throw everything you can at it. I think that's a big reason why sometimes these games do end up being higher scoring, is just that the offenses come in, they've polished more than they have in the past. They've got more stuff under their belt, and they're willing to take a lot more chances. You see a lot more deep shots. You see a lot more, I guess you could say, riskier plays and riskier throws, because you've got to kind of have to leave it all on the line. And you're playing a really high caliber opponent, and you can't afford not to take those risks. I do think to a certain extent the Alabama Clemson games were interesting in that I kind of felt like that's what Clemson could have been all year and just never really played up to that potential. But they were so good that they never had to, and we finally saw what Deshaun Watson could do. I think it's a little similar in some ways to this game that Georgia, outside the one Auburn game, hadn't really needed to put the pedal down for 4 quarters like this. And Oklahoma, really outside a couple instances, also hadn't really had to do it. So you saw two offenses that had let off the gas in almost every game they played, and now they really had to gun it playing each other. And you saw the limits of everything they felt like they could do, and every aggressive move they had to take, and they had to be aggressive the entire game because both teams knew the other team was going to do it and they were going to be successful. And I think that is a major contributor to why they end up being so high scoring.
All right, so before we get into the model, I want to talk about the Alabama offense against Clemson. It's a little weird because we talked about in our preview, and a lot of Georgia fans probably didn't catch that preview. We talked about how we weren't high on Jalen back half of the season. We saw a lot of things that crept in from last year, namely on big stages. So LSU, A&M on the road, Mississippi State, he did okay. Auburn, he absolutely melted down. And we thought there was an opening there for maybe Tua to play because, kind of like you talking about throwing everything at him because it's single elimination, if Jalen came into the Clemson game and played like he did against Auburn, we were worried that it was going to be a repeat. But what we didn't have in that Auburn game is a healthy Alabama defense to sort of bolster the offense and give them just so many possessions and so many short fields that it didn't matter. So give me just a high-level assessment of your takeaway from this game in terms of the Alabama offense. Should Alabama fans be worried going into the Georgia game? And then we'll get into some other questions I got regarding Tua, et cetera.
I think it's interesting how it turned out and how Jalen stayed in the game, but I think it was mainly a function of the score advantage they had and the ineptitude of the Clemson offense. I watched the coaches broadcast version of the games, which, if you're a football geek like me, is actually can be really, really awesome. It's just a lot better for me personally to sit there and listen to the coaches talk, and you get a lot of interesting insights. And sometimes the announcers drive me crazy, though they're pretty good in the semifinals. They made a really solid point that in the third quarter, Alabama's starting field position was the 48-yard line, and Clemson was, I think, the 21. When you start every possession on average at midfield, you don't have to do a ton to score. You need 20, 25 yards in a drive to get a field goal. And Clemson, where they were at offensively at that point in the game, really, I think by the mid-second quarter, I think the Alabama coaching staff realized that there was very little chance that Clemson could win unless they got gifted some sort of turnover. And, they had terrible field position. They could not run the ball at all this entire game. No run threat whatsoever outside occasional Bryant scrambles. And when I say run threat, I mean if it was a design run play, it wasn't going anywhere. The only time they could run the ball was on a pass play when Bryant would scramble. And so there just wasn't really ever any threat that Clemson would score. And I think it caused them to do two things. One, I'm still really not sold that they didn't have a package to put Tua Tagovailoa in this game, and I've heard a million rumors about it. It was mentioned in the broadcast. But when you got to the point where they were up, the only real reason they could lose that game was turnovers. And so you don't want to introduce a player that might be a turnover risk in a game that you know you're going to win if you don't do it. And you can.
Yeah, and that's what I said. I think we talked about this before the game, and then I texted you in the middle of the game, and we were both like, it was some point in the second quarter, and Alabama was clearly dominant on defense, and we both said if they don't bring him in at this point right here, and Clemson doesn't turn around and score, we won't see Tua in this game because now's the point to do it. And I said then, I was like, look, you've got a downside of a turnover machine, potentially. We've seen him throw some bad picks or one bad pick and some other really questionable throws. So that's the downside. but there's that mitigated risk that you introduce when you need yards, points, etc. Well, Alabama didn't need yards, points, etc. So at that point, you're going with a young guy who could turn the ball over. There's really no reason to put him in the game. But I feel like, and I think you kind of hinted at it just here, but maybe what you heard, tell me what you think. I still think in my gut that they've got a package for Tua if they need it. And we're probably planning to play him this game. What do you think?
I think they probably were. And a lot of that really just is by the way that things have gone the past few games. They really haven't had enough success with Jalen to win a high scoring game. And like you said, I think there's about 4 minutes left in the second quarter when they needed to run a hurry up offense. And they didn't. We felt like both of us that if they were going to put him in, that was the time to do it because they needed to go pass first. Instead, they stuck with Jalen. They grinded down the field. They barely got in field goal range, and then they missed a field goal. Um, but if you look at the statistics for the game, hidden in this 24-6 beatdown, quote unquote, Alabama was 5 yards per attempt and 3.4 yards per carry. Those are not great numbers.
No, and that's, part of that. On the flip side, so we talked about how Georgia was going up against a great offense, not a great defense. We all know Clemson has a great front seven, and I think we didn't expect a lot of offensive output from Alabama if they didn't have someone that could stretch the field vertically. And we even saw in the game that there were opportunities there because the offensive line held up pretty well, and Jalen just couldn't execute or capitalize on it. How much of this is your takeaway that you're worried about Alabama's offense if you're an Alabama fan, or Clemson just has an elite defense and there's not much we can take away from it relative to Georgia?
It's always both. A great offense will score on anybody. You see that in the NFL. If you've got an elite quarterback, if you have an elite offense, you can score on any team. Their offense has too many advantages. However, Clemson's defense does present sort of a unique set of challenges. Their front four is truly elite and phenomenal. I mean, you probably have multiple first-round draft picks in that front four. I know that isn't completely unheard of in the SEC, but even by SEC standards, this would be a pretty historic defensive line that Clemson is fronting. And the back seven isn't bad. I know we said they were beatable, but we weren't meaning ever that they were a bad back seven. It was just you have to do anything you can to attack the corners and safeties. I do think the safeties are pretty average because the front four is so good you almost can't beat them. And honestly, the game this reminded me a lot of was Alabama and the Florida State game because they had a huge advantage in field position. And they stopped taking risks almost entirely in that game because they knew they were going to slowly build up field goals off negative plays, and it kept happening. And it was almost like Saban conceded this is just going to be the way the game goes. And I won't say shut it down because it's not quite the right term, but they stopped taking any risks. And they were more than happy to take the easy play in front of them and just grind it out, get a play advantage, and move it. But at the same time, I think in this game, I think you have to be a little bit concerned. I think there were only 5 passes maybe that Hurts threw downfield, 15 yards or more. He completed 1 to Ridley on the 2, which resulted in a touchdown. And then they had the flea flicker that he underthrew pretty badly, and that was due to really just throwing it too late more than underthrowing it, I think, because the ball was in the air for like 50, 60 yards. And then they had about 3 passes that were thrown 20 yards downfield, and all of them were thrown below the knees of the receiver. I don't think any of them were completed.
And for Georgia fans who didn't see the game, the concern coming in this game was the front seven and the pass rush getting to Jalen, forcing him to make mistakes or just to melt down. He had a lot of time, especially not just a lot of time relative to a good pass rush. There were plays, and these plays in particular that you're talking about. So the almost boundary throw to Foster that was in the dirt, the other side of the field, same distance, about 20-yard pass to Ruggs that was in the dirt. These were plays where he had a lot of time to throw, and that same old bugaboo kept coming back. It was he's got a lot of time to throw. He doesn't have a perfect decision to make, and he's not about to throw somebody open, so he's waiting for somebody to come open. But then by the time they come open, he's making a bad throw. So It's interesting you point out Florida State, and I want to just kind of take a break from what we're talking about just as a little fun aside, because so many people said that that Florida State game really wasn't a big win for Alabama. I I think it's safe to say, or at least I say in my opinion, Florida State in week 1 was a tougher challenge for Alabama and a better team than Clemson in the playoffs. What do you think? With Francois.
Honestly, yeah. Having seen them both play and play against each other, I kind of think it's hard to argue against it. I mean, Francois moved the ball against Alabama, and they did get shut down and have some negative plays late, but they were at least a threat to beat Alabama that gave up some things. I mean, Clemson really was a team that wasn't ever threatening to score. That by midway through the third quarter, just gave the game away in 14 seconds, and it was done. And then the last quarter and a half or so didn't matter in this ball game. Florida State was a much more, because what was, I think the game was like 24-10. I mean, it was a much more threatening game, and they kind of ran out of time. And late Alabama was able to put it away. But
Yeah, and Florida State early was able to make some throws. Francois was able to do some things, and Auden Tate, I think, on the edge was a much more threatening receiver than even a pretty good receiver in Kane. I I felt like it was a better opponent. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. I just thought it was an interesting aside after seeing them both play now. And I think that game was like 14-17 or something without Francois when they played Clemson earlier this year. Okay, let's get in the model. We did, for the few of you who maybe didn't catch it, we did a hypothetical. I think it was in week 6, week 7. That said, what if Alabama played Georgia today? What would that look like in terms of our computer model? We had a discussion. We had an easy out because neither one of us picked a winner in that game because it was a hypothetical. Now we have to pick a winner. Talk about what that model score was and kind of the yardage per play predictions were, and then go ahead and let us know about this model for this game, and kind of we'll base the rest of our conversation off of that.
okay, and you can find the video. It's saved on our channel, but we did right after the Texas A&M game and Vanderbilt game. We did a hypothetical of what would happen if Alabama and Georgia played each other. And I guess as a little bit of background there, we went into the season high in Alabama. We were high, really high after Florida State. And then we both picked, I think, Georgia against Notre Dame. And we were really high on Georgia coming out of Notre Dame. We both felt like the Notre Dame game was actually a really bad game by Georgia that they still won because they were that talented. So by week 6, 7 or so, depending on how you wanted to count it, because there's kind of a week 0 this year, we felt like these were sort of the two dominant teams in the SEC, and we both felt like they were both playoff contenders. So we ran this hypothetical. At the time, Georgia was really dominant, and Alabama was too, but they played a weaker schedule. Alabama was giving up. We talk a lot about percentages, opponent percentages allowed. So a lot of the way we look at statistics is how much of your opponent rush average or how much of your opponent passing average have you allowed? Not just how many yards per carry do you allow, but what yard per carry do you allow as a percentage of what your opponents normally get. Alabama was averaging only allowing 70% of opponent averages running the ball. Georgia was only allowing 64%. And again, this pass was similar. Alabama allowing 80%, Georgia allowing 78. If you watched our model video on the semifinals, we talked a lot about it's a lot harder to slow down the pass than it is the run. Very, very, very consistently in our model, we see teams rarely get low numbers on opponent pass percentages, and they can get ridiculously low numbers on opponent rush percentages. That's why passing teams tend to go a little bit further. But when you broke it down, you looked at the offenses where Georgia, Alabama actually held a slight edge offensively, but Georgia held enough of a defensive edge that it predicted Alabama 27, Georgia 28. Now we flip to today. And first, I'm going to mention that I think the perception by a lot of people was Alabama started really hot against a weak schedule. Georgia started a little colder and built, and around the time of the Tennessee game, really turned it on. Mississippi State, Tennessee, and then got rolling around the time we ran this model. And Alabama petered off when their defense got banged up, and Georgia kind of rolled through the end of their schedule with accepting the Auburn game. However, and I say this as a purely statistical point and I guess statistical fact, that isn't really held up by our model. Alabama went from giving up 70% of opponent rush averages in week 7. So following at Texas A&M, before they had all the LSU injuries a few games later, Alabama was allowing 70% of rush averages. To this point in the season, when you add in the second half of the season, they only allowed 62%. So they outperformed their first 6 games in their last 6 games. And I think there's a big asterisk there because the truth is they played such poor rush defenses in the first half of the season. We talked about this a lot at the time. They only gave up 2.57 yards per carry, but there was no way for them to really prove themselves because their opponents, none of them averaged 5 yards per carry. In the later part of the year, they played much better run defenses. And yes, Mississippi State had some real success. And yes, Auburn had some real success. But neither one of those teams managed their actual rush average. Clemson at 4.6 yards per carry didn't even come close at 1.9. So they actually, even when they quote unquote struggled, they still were beating their opponent averages. And they had more of a way to distance themselves from that. And in a couple of the games, LSU and Clemson and Tennessee, they actually did quite well. Again, even the Mississippi State game, they actually held Mississippi State to, I think it was like 3.8 yards per carry. Wasn't nearly as bad as many people think. Georgia, on the other hand, Georgia falls all the way from 64% of opponent averages at midpoint of the year to 80% at the end of the year. The truth of the matter is, in those Auburn games, even in the Georgia Tech game, in the Oklahoma game, they gave up a pretty high percentage of opponents' rush averages. And when you're talking week 6 basically through week 12. If you gave up 64% in the first 6 weeks, what we're saying then is they gave up about 90% in the last 6 weeks. So Georgia's run defense has taken a significant step back statistically in the second half of this year. And in the past, both teams have improved. Actually, Georgia improved from 77 to 75, but Alabama took a big jump from 80% to about 73.8% or 74%. And again, I think a lot of it has been health at different things, the secondary calming down, but a lot of it's also they've played some teams that did throw the ball pretty well, and they were able to sort of prove themselves. And I don't know. I think it goes against the narrative that Alabama was terrible defensively in the second half of the season when they were banged up. I think the real truth of the matter is Alabama just played teams that were a lot better offensively. And conversely, Georgia did really well early part of the year, but they were playing, frankly, really, really bad offenses. And we talked about this a lot that, Missouri was really the only team they played that had thrown the ball with any success before they played Auburn. And they struggled with Auburn's passing game the first time. And then the second time when Auburn didn't have carry on, much like in the UCF game, they're a totally different team. There are some signs that Georgia's defense, I'm not going to say they're flawed because they're very good, but there are signs that it's beatable. There were signs of that going into the Oklahoma game. I think the Oklahoma game validated that because, Rondy Anderson had a fair amount of success, right? I mean, Rondy Anderson rushed for, let me pull it up, 7.7 yards per carry. Baker Mayfield, 8.2 yards per attempt. You can beat that defense. And due to all that, we switched from Georgia being a 1-point favorite to Alabama being a 2-point favorite in our model. And so now our model actually favors Alabama 25-23.
It's interesting. You're talking about, you're kind of down on Georgia's defense there, but even the Rodney Anderson thing to me, I think is a lot a function of how they were having to play Baker Mayfield. And I just think he's so good. And when you first see that passing attack, and one of the things that was interesting about the coach's room, another shout out for that feed. I think everybody should watch that. I can't watch it during the games as much because I'm so used to the traditional broadcast, but going back and watching it is pretty interesting. In the first half, they all said the problem Georgia's having right now is they're trying to do everything. They're trying to defend everything, which means they're not doing anything well. And then in the second half, when they said, all right, we're gonna change our personnel up a little bit, and we're gonna give them a little bit different look and stop one thing, which I think it was stop the run and effectively just put a lot of pressure on Mayfield with a blitz and say, okay, beat us man to man or whatever. Then everything switched, and they gave up 10 points in the second half, I think, or 10 points for the rest of the game. 7 points was a defensive score. So I'm not as down on Georgia's defense, I think, as you are. And I know you're not saying you're down on Georgia's defense. You're just saying they're maybe not as elite as everybody perceived. I still think they're pretty dang elite. And I think one of the things that has historically given Alabama trouble, Jalen trouble, Alabama's offensive line trouble, is not necessarily a crazy good defense, but a crazy athletic front seven and front four. And it reminds me of how much Jalen struggled 2 years in a row, and especially last year, against a Texas A&M defense that was pretty horrid in the secondary, but had 2 or 3 players in that front seven that could get after it, and it caused him just enough issue that he was rendered almost ineffective. And for Alabama fans who are saying, well, Jalen won a big game against Clemson. He did not. And you and I predicted this, and I want you to get into this a little bit. We both predicted that Alabama, if they didn't play Tua, I think the model had it like 24-24 or something like that. We both said they were going to have a really hard time scoring with Jalen, and that if they didn't play Tua, they would probably lose. And offensively, I think they put out a game that they would have lost. What we undersold, I think, was just how good Alabama's defense is when healthy, but I'm not sure you can count on every team you play only crossing the 53 times. So is that fair to say that, like, yeah, Alabama won the game, but our miss in calling that was not how we evaluated Jalen, but how we undersold Alabama's defense?
Absolutely. I mean, my prediction for that game was 24-17. And you asked me, or 24-21 rather, 24-21, and your prediction was 21-27. So we both predicted Clemson F21. I predicted 24, you predicted 17. When you asked me about that and how much the injuries factored in and getting those linebackers back, my answer was I thought the offense might get 17 points, and I said I'm solely giving them 24 points because I think the health of their linebackers may produce some sort of non-traditional score, defensive score, because the linebackers, when they were in the past few years, that caliber linebacker for Alabama has produced about a score a game. Well, 24 points was exactly what Alabama scored in that game, and sure enough, one of
Don't pat yourself on the back. You said 24 points with a defensive score. You didn't say that Levi Wallace was going to tip a ball and Mac Wilson was going to run it back and score it on the left side of the end zone. So I don't think you did that right.
So I mean, and you know, I'm not trying to be cocky with that or anything, but I mean, I actually did predict the score, and I predict exactly how they were going to get the score, right? I mean, maybe not didn't name the play, but I said 24 points with a defensive score thrown in. And we don't say that stuff sort of as lightly in terms of making up our own version of events for the game. I just thought that was kind of where their offensive and defensive output would be, and that's why I thought that was the likely result. The thing that I missed was Clemson 21. We didn't think Alabama would score a ton of points. As I said, Alabama statistically was not great in that Clemson game. It is highly unlikely that Alabama scores 24 points with that kind of offensive output. And, you know, we like to give for comparisons in yard per play. Alabama only averaged 3.95 yards per play in that game. They averaged under 4 yards per play. That was half a yard worse than their worst game, which was Florida State in the opener, and they scored 24 in that one due to a ton of short fields. But, you know, Auburn, they had 5.15 yards per play, and they scored 14. I mean, almost a yard and a half per play more against Auburn than Clemson. People, because they scored points, their perception is they were a lot better against Clemson, even offensively, than they were against Auburn. That's not the case. They were worse, significantly worse, almost a third worse. And you know, I think we both kind of predicted that. We predicted a low scoring slugfest. We talked about how anytime the score was this low, that variation takes effect. I think what really happened here was the score, it was as ugly as we thought it was. And either Clemson would get a couple breaks and might win in a close game, or the opposite happened. Alabama got the breaks. That gave them, again, a 2 touchdown, 3 touchdown lead. and it just completely put the game away. Alabama was able to, like we said, I think the yard per play total is really deceptive because in the second half, especially once they got those turnovers, Alabama wasn't even really trying to score anymore. They just needed to try to sustain a drive and burn clock because they knew Clemson was not going to score 3 times unless they gave him a turnover. But yeah, for sure, the the expectations we had for this game were not out of whack at all offensively for Alabama. They did struggle quite a bit in this game. The thing we underestimated really was how good was Alabama's defense when the linebackers were healthy. It wasn't just better, it was almost night and day better. I mean, and we talked a little bit and probably not given enough credit. People talk about the guys that were out, but Rashaan Evans played with a severe groin pull and missed a couple games with it, re-aggravated it, and then he played almost with one leg against Auburn. Um, Anthony Jennings, who may not play in the Georgia game, but he'd had a sprained ankle for much of the year. He'd missed time. He went out in the Florida State game. Point
And he was the
yeah,
MVP
yeah.
by far.
And so, point being, a lot of the guys that did play, Deshaun Hand, he'd had a sprained MCL, and in the Auburn game, and he'd missed time. None of them had been healthy, and a huge one was Minka Fitzpatrick pulled his hamstring, and they were playing him maybe 1 out of every 3 plays the last third of the season. So they didn't just get guys back; they got guys back. A lot of the guys that had played were, maybe 50%, and they were fully healthy. And again, in the Auburn game, I saw a lot of Clemson fans. I thought it was funny that talked about how they'd lost a starter in Moses, and now we're going to see how this Wilson kid is. It's like, no, Wilson was the starter from the beginning of the season. Moses was the 4th-string true freshman who sprained his ankle at the start of the Auburn game and had to play anyway because there was literally no one else to play. Um, so I mean, it just was tremendously different. And it's not that they were bad before, but they were pretty much elite plus in the Clemson game. Maybe not quite on par with what we've seen the past couple years, which were, frankly, that those 2015, 2016 defenses, that last year's in particular, were almost historically good. But yeah, I mean, they were still certainly in absolutely up to the standard of Alabama defense when they actually had most of, if not all, the starters healthy. And I will say Deontay Thompson, the safety 14, was all over the freaking field. And Hootie Jones, who had been the starter that was a senior, was honestly kind of a liability against Auburn in particular.
Yeah,
And
he was.
Thompson,
And
I
Mississippi
think
State.
Thompson may actually just be a significantly better player than the guy he replaced.
So I have this theory, and this is I said going into this game or going into the playoffs that the tougher draw for Alabama would be Georgia, because as much as I fear Oklahoma's offense as someone who's predicting a game and knowing they're going to score their points, I felt like Jalen Hurts could really have success. He doesn't do poorly against bad defenses. He dominates bad defenses, and Alabama's overall physicality would have success in the same way that Georgia did, which I don't understand why they were throwing the ball in the first half at all. They could have run Navy's offense and just killed Oklahoma. But anyway, now coming into this game, it's a different makeup for this Alabama defense because they're facing what I think is a little tougher challenge even though it's a pro-style offense, because Clemson's offense wasn't, in my opinion, I think it was Alabama's defense was a very bad matchup for them. It was almost tailor-made for Alabama's defense to just crush. I've always said, everybody talks about how you got to have a great scrambling quarterback to beat Alabama, and you and I both have said you have to have a great quarterback. Not necessarily mobile, just a great quarterback. I take that a step further and say, to beat Alabama, you have to be good on one side of the ball and elite on the other side of the ball. So if you look at like 2012 Texas A&M, they were good enough defensively, not great, good enough to be decent on that side of the ball and elite on the other side of the ball. 2010 Auburn, they were elite offensively, not great defensively, but good enough. The question I have with Georgia, and this is why I'm having a hard time picking them, maybe you can sway me in another direction, is Georgia isn't elite on either side of the ball, but they are good to good plus on both sides of the ball. Is that in aggregate enough to beat Alabama.
I think it's a little more matchup specific than that. Alabama this year has struggled as a passing team. And I know we had this conversation, offline on who would be the better matchup if Alabama won the game. And the reason we had that is we both kind of were of the same opinion. If Alabama played Oklahoma, they could run the Jalen Hurts offense and do his kind of crazy scramble drill stuff. And I think it would have been pretty dominant because much like Georgia's seen, if you can't stop Alabama from running the ball with that style of offense, they don't ever have to expose Hurts' weaknesses in the passing game, and they just grind you out, take over the game, play count gets away from you, and they win. Georgia's not all that dissimilar. And what I think's interesting is I think for both teams, they're going to have issues because where the opposing defense's strengths lie. Georgia's defense is very disruptive, like you said. They have good, fast athletes. I don't expect Jalen Hurts running to be a huge factor in this game. And the reason is when you got guys like Lorenzo Carter and Roquan Smith roaming the outside, Jalen just can't outrun those guys. And his tendency is to try to do so, even when it doesn't really work. And so now you got to worry about the inside run game. And Georgia has been very good. I mean, Ledbetter, Thompson, Atkins, those guys can play some serious football and they're physical. Now, I do think Alabama is going to be able to run some on Georgia. There's been too many instances, I think, where Georgia has given up solid yardage on the ground. And I'm not saying that Alabama is going to have significant success. And like you said earlier, it sounded like I was being really down on the defense. I was not. I was just saying that when we're looking at two elite teams, it's sort of relative. Georgia has given up over 5 yards per carry on multiple occasions this year. They did it against Auburn. They did it against Oklahoma. And again, if you want to compare it, this is where I get kind of concerned because, Alabama hasn't done that. Even when they've lost, the defense against Auburn gave up 3.4 yards per carry, against LSU 3.6, against Mississippi State 3.5. When 3.6 yards per carry is the worst you've given up all year, you start to realize that nobody is really ever going to run on Alabama with any real success. There are signs you can run against Georgia, and I know that's your point. It's that Georgia is a very good run defense. Alabama is not going to dominate the game offensively. Alabama's not even going to have any consistent success, but they can have some success. And that can be difficult because Alabama is so good in every phase that it doesn't really matter if you're a passing team, a run team, or wherever your strength is, they're going to kind of limit it. And you don't expect Georgia to dominate in the run game simply because no one has not only has no one been able to dominate Alabama by running the ball, no one has even really been able to be successful. Even in their loss again at Auburn, Auburn had 3.6 yards per carry. They succeeded in that game because Stidham was able to really open it up vertically. And that again was a game where Alabama was just massively depleted defensively and still didn't give up a ton of yards. I will say, in my opinion, the weakness for Georgia is really, I don't think their secondary is phenomenal. I think there's some signs at safety and corner that they're beatable. I think they're still quite good. But we talked about this a little bit more with the semifinal. I thought it was capable to be beaten, which is why we thought it was going to be a high scoring game. Alabama's not going to be able to exploit that. And I do think they're going to have a lot of success, but to sort of wrap it all around, and I don't know that I have a clean point here, or I've done a very good job of making it. I don't think Georgia's going to be able to shut down Alabama's run game. I am concerned that Alabama may be able to shut down Georgia's just because, as we've discussed several times on here before, an elite defense can shut down any run defense. I don't care how good you are. It is possible to shut down any run defense if if you are an elite defense. It's just, there's a reason why nobody in the NFL is a run first offense anymore. Even, the Tennessee Titans have limited success with a phenomenal offensive line and a phenomenal set of tailbacks. And I think Godwin is a solid receiver. I think Wims has turned into a very good receiver, but I don't know that in Wims and Godwin, you have the sort of athletes you need to really stretch Alabama or even expose them in the passing game, it just, I'm concerned. Alabama controlled Clemson with a 5-man front for most of that game. I don't think they're going to do that against Georgia. They're going to have a much more standard front, but uh, you know, really all season, Georgia has always gotten numbers advantages that's let them get some plays here and there in the passing game to get the other team honest. They're probably not going to get that against Alabama. And I don't know that they're elite enough to shut down Alabama and keep them from ever scoring defensively. And I don't know that they're elite enough to be able to run on their, lean on their offense and move the ball, running the ball. So I'm kind of with you.
They are elite at tailback, though, and that's something Alabama throughout Saban's tenure has shut down running games. But I can't say for sure that they've faced this good of a 2 or 3 headed rushing attack that many times. Certainly not this year. Geis and Williams at LSU are great. They're good, not great. But they're a different style back. They're not this big. They're not this combination of size and speed. I think both sides are going to be a little shocked. I think Georgia's going to be shocked that they're not going to be able to easily get the edge, and Alabama eats toss sweeps for lunch. I mean, that's not a play. They're going to have to be able to run inside to have success. But I also think Alabama's going to be a little surprised at how hard these guys are to get down and how big they are relative to their speed. And I know it's SEC and they see this kind of tailback a lot, blah, blah, blah. I think Michelle and Chubb are just a different animal. So if we're talking about they're not elite on either side of the ball, I still maintain that in terms of full units. But as far as a pure rushing attack, I got to say they're elite.
Yeah, I agree. And I really, I guess you sort of hit the nail on the head with what I was trying to get across. And it's the one area where Georgia is truly elite is in run offense. And the one area where Alabama is probably elite is run defense. And conversely, Alabama is elite in its quarterback run game. And Georgia's defense is probably elite in its ability to disrupt and move side to side. So really the two areas where both teams have an offensive style that can really get an edge on teams, both defenses are absolutely elite at stopping that factor. And yeah, I mean, that's concerning. And that's why I kind of fall back to receivers and other things. I think Fromm is amazingly, even as a true freshman, probably a better passer than Jalen. I think
He is.
they don't ask him to do as much, but he's a better passer. And what he's really good at is taking. I'm always impressed at the ability he has to take the easy play, and that sounds like a simple thing, but he finds the open guy and takes the play and delivers the ball accurately and efficiently on those plays. And that's not something that Jalen Hurts always does. I mean, he misses a lot of easy targets. Again, in the semifinal game, there's the big touchdown pass to Ridley that they broke down a bunch on television that kind of had me screaming when it happened live, because it's like, how does a quarterback not see that? How does the QB who's staring at the receiver not realize that guy's wide open, because Clemson really had a coverage bust and didn't have anybody middle. They didn't have a middle of the field safety on that play or a linebacker. Either that or the linebacker's supposed to sink. You can't give that open. Um, but on the flip side, I don't know that Georgia's receivers are capable of getting separation, whereas I think Alabama's receivers have a significant edge probably on Georgia's corners. The problem is the quarterback that could get them the ball is going to be with the receivers that can't get open, and the quarterback that will have guys open isn't going to be the guy won't be able to get them the ball. I don't know. It's just everywhere I look, it's a conundrum.
It's interesting because given all these matchups, Alabama fans are going to kill me for saying this, but given all these matchups, I'm having a hard time picking a winner in this game. But given these matchups, if you swap the quarterbacks, I think Alabama kills them.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I mean, if you swap the quarterbacks, with all the run offense Georgia had, they'd be that much more effective. But Alabama's corners could single Georgia's receivers, I think, and have a pretty good amount of success if Jalen was the quarterback. I don't think I don't think they're going to have enough. They would have enough separation for Jalen to exploit it, and the offense would probably shut down. And conversely, Alabama would have a pretty significant edge at receiver. And if they had a quarterback from that could deliver it, and again, realize I know Alabama fans and Georgia fans are going to be upset at some things I've said or they're being critical. We're very honest on this on this show. You're in the national title against another national title team. You have to understand that, when you say Alabama's receivers have an edge, that's only because Alabama's receivers might be the best unit in the country or they're close to it. And they don't look that way statistically because and this is why we're so critical of Alabama's quarterback play. You have to understand Alabama's passing game as an average to above average passing game is more of a function of an absolutely freaky elite receiving core and a pretty darn below average passer that combines to completing some pretty good plays because you have what is likely multiple first round draft picks at receiver. Eh,
Yeah, I think that's worth noting. Alabama usually plays a three wide set. Their three deep at three wide will all make an NFL roster, without
Yeah,
a doubt.
yeah, and that's it's not to say Godwin isn't good or Wims isn't good or Hardman isn't good. I think Wims will probably make an NFL roster and maybe even be a mid round pick. I think Godwin will probably make an NFL team. Alabama's looking at a guy in Ridley that will probably be a first round draft pick this year. Um, a guy in Judy that looks like he'll be a first round draft pick. They've got another guy in Ruggs that looks like he may be a first round draft pick. Devonta Smith is going to be a starting NFL receiver, I think. It's an absolute embarrassment of riches, primarily with their younger receivers. And
And you've got two number one. And I know we're just going on and on and on about this, but we got two. We're talking about two other best at their position coming out of high school, Cam Sims and Robert Foster's, who are buried on the depth chart, but still have every single measurable in the world that will get them on an NFL roster. So I think Georgia fans, they're kind of like Clemson fans in that regard, in that they're going to bristle a little bit at what we're saying, because you said some of the similar things about Clemson secondary, where that's where you have a weakness, but we're saying this in the context of you're facing an elite team as an elite team, so we got to talk about this thing in picking nits. So okay, so we don't run this thing just crazy into the dirt, let's go ahead and do our picks. Give me your gut pick, remind us of the computer model score, and give me your gut pick. Let's see what you got.
okay, so the computer model score for this one is Alabama 25, Georgia 23. My gut is that this game probably won't be that high scoring. I think these two defenses are too well suited to stop the main component for the opposing offense, which is a rushing attack. This so I'm going to back down a little bit, and I think I'm going to go 17-10 Alabama. And the only thing that's making me think Alabama will win is when you're that low scoring, you need fast, explosive players making big plays. And to me, I think their receivers give them the ability to hit one or two shots that I don't think, as good as Fromm is at taking the easy play, he has not been a big play, big passing quarterback in large part because of the receiving core. I think Alabama can generate one or two shot plays despite really poor offensive production. But I don't think either offense is going to be overly successful.
I think it's going to be a little higher score than that, mainly for what I was saying before, in that in games like this, in championship games, offenses find points, and then the other offense steps up to the challenge. So I have a little bit of a concern with the fact that Lester Cotton, a pretty important right guard for Alabama, went down with a leg injury that looked pretty. It didn't look bad on video, but when I think anytime you got a guy that huge that can barely walk off the field, it looks bad. And then their defensive MVP, the MVP of the game, in my opinion, was Anthony Jennings, and he looked real bad coming off the field. And they said it's a sprained knee, so it's not, an ACL or MCL tear, but it took Deshaun Hand weeks to come back from his MCL sprain, and he still doesn't look like he looked in the first week. So if Anthony Jennings can't play, we're getting somehow they keep finding a way to win without key players. They're getting huge injuries in every win. I think every big win for Alabama this year has been sort of just kind of a downer because you got to deal with the injuries as well. So that's giving me a little pause. Georgia's running game's giving me a little pause for just they're just so good, and there's Alabama has great running backs, but they haven't been able to stick with the good running backs, in my opinion, or the guys that are really doing it this year. And Bo, I don't know. I don't get why Bo is getting so many carries. So earlier in the year when I was saying Alabama's got a great offensive or running game and Georgia didn't have as good of a running game, I think that's flipped. And I'm rambling a little bit because I don't know what to do. But I'm going to go 24-20 Alabama. And I think Tua plays. I think Tua plays 2 series in this game, gets them some points, doesn't start, isn't a main focal point. I think they're going to see early on that they can't shut down Georgia like they were able to with Clemson, and they're going to need a spark. And Tua comes in and plays 24-20 Alabama, and I would not be at all surprised if it was 24-20 Georgia. I don't think this is going to be a huge scoring game, and I don't think either team's fan base is going to be super comfortable in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I agree. And, I gave a prediction because you had to make me sort of nail it down, right? I've been really, really high on Georgia all year. I've been really, really high on Alabama all year. I am not high at all on either team's ability to score on the other. And, maybe I'm too low. There's a lot of precedent in these games that they're higher scoring than you think they're going to be. But to me, this has all the hallmarks of an LSU Alabama game. Those 10-0 games. You've got a Georgia team that is a pro style offense with a competent but somewhat limited passer and a really powerful pro style rushing attack. And you have an Alabama offense that has a lot of limitations against a very disruptive defense. And what we continually have seen in those games is Alabama shuts down the opposing offense almost completely, and they find one or two explosive plays where basically the advantages they have in talent in skill players lets them get, steal 10 or 14 points. And that's how they win. That's what on paper this looks like, but I have no confidence in it whatsoever. It's just tough, and it's so good on good. I am with you though that, even though this is a national championship, I feel like there probably was a plan in place to get to some snaps in the Clemson game. And especially, I think there was at the very least, I absolutely think there was a plan in place that if they were down or if they were really struggling offensively, they were going to put him in to get a spark. This is a game where they may have to consider, we've got to play him because we may not be able to score if we don't. And I don't know. I mean, I'm rambling too, because I just have no confidence in making this pick, because it is so low and it's going to be so variable. And I don't know. I mean, there's a red flag to me that I think Georgia's defense might actually be able to be run on by a powerful offensive rushing attack. And there is a red flag to me that I think Alabama's offense may completely shut down, or that Fromm may be able to run a balanced attack and move on them the way Auburn did. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting to me. I think the Oklahoma game a little bit unfairly skewed some numbers for Georgia statistically in our computer model. But I also think having all those players out for Alabama unfairly skewed the statistics. And I think we saw that to be true. We talked about this in the Clemson preview, that there's no way to factor all of that in. So even with the computer model, I don't know how comfortable I am. I think it's doing right by saying it's going to be a lower scoring game, even though both of these teams score a ton of points. But the funny thing to me, and this is, I know we weren't going to talk about salt, but the funny thing to me is you talked about a 17-10, 17-13 type game. For all the people that are bitching about two SEC teams in the final game, wouldn't it be hilarious if the final score was like 10-9? Like, just to add a little insult to injury, because they hate defensive games anyway, so it's like a big middle finger to all those people too.
You look at this, and the more I look at it, the more I am seeing the 2011 LSU Alabama game 1. Like on paper, that's what this is. You have a I mean, you
9-6
have a
overtime.
dominant pro style offense and defense in Georgia that's really dynamic, and you have a really really good dominant Alabama team that continually plays pretty tight. I mean that 9-6 result would not shock me absolutely in the least.
Yeah, and you talk about Alabama's advantage at wide receiver. You didn't even mention Payne, which is interesting because that's a pretty big receiver to match up against that Georgia secondary. So, I know everybody's seen that play by now, so I don't want to go any further. All right, so we're rambling on too much. Let's close this one out. You got anything else for this game before we close out the 2017 football season?
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll say is I think you're going to know pretty quick how this game's going to go. If Georgia can get in the backfield and really disrupt Alabama, then I know you're going to you should know you're going to have a really tight game and it will absolutely be 50-50 in who wins. If Alabama at the start of the game is able to get push and run for 5 yards or more per carry, um, then there's a sign that Georgia's run defense may not hold up. I think we know what we're going to get from Georgia offensively, and I may be surprised. And this is very typical of every game we've ever done from Alabama. You generally either you match Alabama, in which case you're going to have a dogfight, or you don't match Alabama and you lose by a fair margin. No one has been able to blow Alabama out under Saban, period. It just hasn't happened because really they just have too much of a talent advantage. So it's not like I'm crazy in saying that. But yeah, I think you're going to know in about 2 series how this game's going to go. And it'll be interesting because I predicted Georgia lost for the first time all year in the semifinal, and I predicted I think 42-39. That really wasn't in any way, I think, unfeasible when you look at the result of that game. I was giving Mayfield the credit for being able to pull out the game-winning drive with 55 seconds that they didn't try to attempt. That's basically what that came down to. And yeah, and the same gut that made me think that also makes me think they're probably going to more or less shut down Alabama, and this is going to be the complete opposite.
Well, I picked Georgia. I also picked them to win the East, and you didn't. So I told you I was going to remind you of that all year. The other thing for me with Alabama that I think is interesting that might play into this, 2 years in a row they gave up a lot of points against Clemson because 2 years in a row they had this short week to prepare for them. I do think that this Georgia offense is easier to prepare for Nick Saban on a short week than Oklahoma would have been. So there's that. I don't know how much that's worth at this point. So it's late. We're going to wind it down. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging with us to the end. I think we get more podcast listeners listening all the way through than we do on YouTube. So thanks for both sets of listeners there. YouTube, remember, give us a like if you like it. Give us a downvote if you hated it. Just tell us why.
Okay.
Man, it was a fun season.
I got to jump in one thing real quick, too, and say, podcast listeners, if you're listening, please go on iTunes and give us a rating, good or bad. Just give us a rating and a comment. We don't necessarily see how many we get because the way podcasts work, and we don't know how many new people we get. Giving us some ratings and exposure would be really helpful if you want to see stuff in the future because we only have, I think, a couple right now.
Yeah, we don't prioritize our podcast as much as we should, and that's my fault. We even missed some for the bowl season, getting them out to the podcast that we usually get everything out there. So that's a good note. Podcast listeners, we sometimes forget you, and I'm sorry about that. Tim, shout out. I know he's a podcast listener. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.